Part 1. Introduction. Why this document matters. There are moments in history when a government publishes a document that is more than just a policy paper. It is instead an attempt to explain how it sees the world, why it believes the existing order is no longer adequate, and how it imagines the future might be organized. The Chinese paper entitled
构建更加公正合理的全球治理体系，中国的理念、倡议与行动
Constructing a more just and reasonable global governance system, China's ideas, initiatives, and actions is one such document. Whether one agrees with its assumptions or not, this paper deserves careful attention because it offers one of the clearest statements yet of how the People's Republic of China presently understands international order and how it believes global governance should evolve during the 21st century. This is not merely a foreign policy document. It is also an exercise in political philosophy, an argument about history, a critique of existing institutions, a proposal for future international cooperation, and perhaps more significantly, an attempt to articulate an alternative vocabulary through which international relations might be understood. To understand this document is therefore not simply to understand contemporary Chinese diplomacy. It is also to ask much larger questions. What constitutes legitimacy in world politics? Who writes the rules of international order? Can institutions created largely in the middle of the 20th century adequately govern the complexities of the 21st? Can the international system continue to be organized primarily around the assumptions of a single civilization, ideology, or power center? Or are we entering a genuinely plural world in which multiple visions of political order coexist simultaneously? These questions sit at the very center of this white paper, and they matter not merely for China and the United States. They matter for every country. They matter for Australia. Indeed, for Australia, they may matter rather more than is commonly appreciated. The historical moment. Every great statement of international order emerges from a particular historical context. The authors of the United Nations Charter wrote in the shadow of the Second World War. The architects of the Bretton Woods system wrote amidst economic devastation. The creators of the European project wrote after centuries of continental conflict. Likewise, this Chinese white paper emerges from its own historical circumstances. The world today faces major power competition, armed conflicts in multiple regions, economic fragmentation, technological transformation, artificial intelligence, climate change, energy insecurity, demographic pressures, pandemic vulnerabilities. and increasing dissatisfaction among many developing countries regarding the distribution of power within the international institutions. The paper argues that humanity faces what Chinese discourse frequently calls
百年未有之大变局
a great transformation unseen in a century. This phrase has become one of the most important organizing concepts in contemporary Chinese political thought. Its meaning is profound. It suggests that the international system established after 1945 is not simply undergoing routine adjustment. Rather, it is experiencing structural transformation. Economic power is diffusing. Technological capabilities are spreading. Political influence is becoming increasingly multipolar. The global south is becoming more economically and politically significant. New technologies are generating problems that no state can solve alone. Under these conditions, the white paper argues that global governance arrangements must also change. Whether this diagnosis is entirely correct is, of course, open to debate. But the argument itself is intellectually serious and merits careful examination. What is global governance? The central concept of the document is
全球治理
global governance. The term itself is important. Governance is not the same as government. There is no world government. There is no global sovereign. Global governance instead refers to the mechanisms through which humanity attempts to manage collective problems. These mechanisms include international law, international organizations, multilateral arrangements, norms, customary practices, economic arrangements, technological standards, and networks of cooperation between governments and institutions. Examples include the United Nations, the World Health Organization, the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, international environmental agreements, and increasingly emerging frameworks for digital governance and artificial intelligence. China's white paper acknowledges that global governance is necessary. It does not advocate international contestation, nor does it reject multilateral institutions. Rather, it argues that existing governance structures require reform because they insufficiently reflect contemporary realities. This distinction is crucial. The document generally presents itself not as a revolutionary manifesto aimed at destroying international institutions, but as an argument for an intense process of adaptation and rebalancing. That distinction may prove enormously significant in future debates. The language of justice and reason. The title itself contains another critical phrase.
公正合理
Just and reasonable. These words require close attention. In many Western policy documents, discussions of international order frequently revolve around concepts such as liberalism, rules, rights, democracy, markets, or security. The Chinese formulation places different emphasis. Justice,
公正
suggests fairness, equity, and legitimacy. Reason
合理
suggests proportionality, practicality, and arrangements appropriate to present circumstances. The pairing is philosophically interesting. The argument appears to be that international order should be not merely lawful, but also be perceived as being fair, not merely stable, but also legitimate, not merely inherited from history, but continually adapted to changing realities. One may accept or reject this proposition, but it raises a fundamental question. Can international institutions remain effective if large numbers of states no longer believe those institutions adequately represent contemporary distributions of power and interests? That question may become one of the defining questions of international politics during the coming decades. A community with a shared future for mankind. Perhaps the most notable concept associated with contemporary Chinese diplomacy is
人类命运共同体
a community with a shared future for mankind. This concept appears repeatedly throughout Chinese international discourse. At first glance, the phrase sounds aspirational, perhaps a little too idealistic, yet it also reflects a particular theory of international relations. The theory begins from a simple proposition. Humanity's major challenges are increasingly interconnected. Climate change does not respect national borders. Pandemics ignore sovereignty. Cyber threats transcend geography. Artificial intelligence may reshape every economy simultaneously. Financial crises spread internationally. Supply chains are globally integrated. Consequently, states are increasingly bound together by common vulnerabilities. The concept therefore proposes that security and prosperity cannot be pursued exclusively through zero-sum competition, where one participant's gain is exactly offset by another's loss. Again, reasonable observers may disagree about how this principle should be implemented. Yet the underlying diagnosis that interdependence has deepened considerably is difficult to dismiss too readily. Why Australia should pay attention? At first glance, an Australian audience may regard this white paper as distant diplomatic rhetoric. That would be a mistake. Australia is one of the world's most globally integrated middle powers. Australia's prosperity depends heavily upon international trade. Security depends upon regional stability. Universities depend upon international collaboration. Technological future depends upon international standards. Energy transition depends upon international supply chains. Economic future depends heavily upon developments throughout Asia. Consequently, any serious proposal concerning the future structure of global governance inevitably has major implications for Australia. The question for Australia is not whether it agrees entirely with China's vision, nor is the question whether China's proposals will inevitably prevail. The more important question may be this: if the world is genuinely entering an era of multiple centers of power and multiple competing ideas of international order, Does Australia possess the intellectual, institutional, and diplomatic flexibility and capacity necessary to operate successfully within such a rapidly emerging environment? That question may become one of the defining governance challenges confronting Australia during the 21st century. And it is with that question in mind that we now turn to the central concepts and ideas contained within this highly consequential document. Part 2, the intellectual architecture of China's global governance vision. When reading China's white paper on global governance, one quickly discovers that it is not simply a collection of diplomatic proposals. Rather, it is an attempt to construct an entire conceptual architecture, a way of thinking about international order, legitimacy, cooperation, and historical change. Like all systems of political thought, it begins with a range of assumptions. Its assumptions are not always identical to those that have traditionally informed Western international relations theory. Understanding these assumptions is therefore essential. Only then can we understand not merely what China is proposing, but why. And perhaps equally important for Australian listeners, we may begin to appreciate how these ideas could shape the international environment within which Australia must operate during the coming decades. Global governance.
全球治理，
The central concept of the white paper is
全球治理，
global governance. The term governance is important. It differs fundamentally from government. China is not proposing the establishment of a world state. Rather, global governance refers to the collection of rules, institutions, norms, and cooperative arrangements through which states of whatever political, religious, or cultural persuasion attempt to manage what are essential common problems to us all. These include international organizations, treaties, international law, development institutions, technological standards, climate agreements, health mechanisms, financial arrangements, and increasingly, systems governing digital technologies and artificial intelligence. The white paper's argument can be summarized as follows. The world has changed dramatically. The mechanisms governing the world have not changed sufficiently. Therefore, governance arrangements require reform. This set of propositions is hardly unique to China. Indeed, many scholars across the world have observed similar tensions. The economic distribution of power found in 1945 differs greatly from that confronting the world in 2026. Many of today's largest economies were comparatively poor countries when major post-war institutions were established. Many newly independent states had not yet achieved sovereignty. Technological questions such as cybersecurity, digital sovereignty, artificial intelligence, and biotechnology were scarcely imaginable. The white paper therefore presents governance reforms as a practical necessity. Yet it goes further. It suggests that reform is not merely desirable, it is morally necessary. For China, governance arrangements that fail to reflect contemporary realities may increasingly lose legitimacy. The idea of justice.
公正，
The first word in the title is
公正，
justice or fairness. This term deserves careful attention. In Chinese political discourse, justice frequently carries an important international dimension. A governance system is considered just if states are treated as formally equal. Development opportunities are broadly accessible. Representation is reasonably distributed, and rules are applied evenly, not selectively. Whether one agrees with these criteria is a separate matter. The point is that legitimacy is being linked to perceptions of fairness. This reflects an important insight. Political systems ultimately depend not merely upon power, but also upon consent and legitimacy. International systems are no different. The Roman Empire possessed military strength, yet eventually it lost legitimacy. European colonial systems possessed military power, yet eventually they lost legitimacy. Even great powers ultimately require a degree of acceptance from others. The White Paper repeatedly returns to this idea. International governance must be seen as fair if it is to remain effective and be viewed by a vast number of people as legitimate. The idea of reasonableness.
合理，
Reasonable. This term can also mean appropriate, rational, proportionate, consistent with circumstances. This concept introduces a degree of pragmatism. A governance arrangement that may have been entirely reasonable in 1945 may not remain reasonable indefinitely. Institutions must evolve. Representation may need adjustment. Rules may require adaptation. New technologies may require regulation. Emerging powers may seek greater participation. The White Paper therefore presents international order, not as something fixed and permanent, but as something organic and evolutionary. This view has important implications. It implies that international order should be capable of evolving, of even peaceful adaptation. If adaptation becomes impossible, pressures may accumulate. History offers many examples. The Concert of Europe, a 19th century diplomatic framework established by the major powers, Great Britain, Austria, Prussia, Russia, and later France, at the Congress of Vienna in 1815, gradually became incapable of accommodating the forces of nationalism. European imperial systems, especially following the turmoil of World War II, proved unable to absorb indigenous demands for decolonization. The Cold World Order, underpinned by a doctrine of mutual assured destruction, MAD, ultimately became unsustainable. China's White Paper argues that a high degree of flexibility and concrete reforms are therefore essential to long-term stability of the global order. Multilateralism.
多边主义，
Another foundational concept is
多边主义，
multilateralism. At first glance, this appears familiar. Australia has long described itself as a strong supporter of multilateral institutions. China similarly presents itself, especially since its entry into the World Trade Organization, WTO, in 2001, as a defender of multilateral cooperation. However, similarities in language sometimes conceal differences in emphasis. Within the white paper, multilateralism appears to involve several principles: consultation, respect for sovereignty, non-exclusivity, broad participation, institutional reform, and opposition to unilateral decision-making. In practical terms, the paper suggests that major international questions should not be determined solely by powerful states acting independently. Rather, solutions should emerge through collective processes. This idea possesses significant appeal. Middle powers have often favored multilateral arrangements precisely because they provide opportunities to influence outcomes that would otherwise be dominated by great powers. Australia itself has repeatedly benefited from multilateral mechanisms. The challenge, however, lies in implementation. All states support multilateralism in principle. The difficulty arises when specific interests conflict. Consequently, multilateralism remains as much an aspiration as an institutional reality. Sovereign equality.
主权平等，
The white paper repeatedly emphasizes
主权平等，
sovereign equality. This principle originates in international law. The United Nations Charter rests upon the proposition that all states possess equal sovereignty. China places considerable emphasis upon this principle. The concept means that all states possess equal legal status. All states have the right to determine their own political systems. All states should participate in international affairs, and no state possesses inherent authority to dominate others. Again, this principle is not uniquely Chinese. It forms one of the foundations of modern international law. Yet China arguably places greater emphasis upon sovereignty than many contemporary Western approaches. This difference has practical implications. Questions involving humanitarian intervention, human rights, cyber governance, data regulation, economic sanctions, and political conditionality may be approached differently. These differences do not necessarily imply irreconcilable conflict. However, they do suggest that debates concerning sovereignty may become increasingly significant in future global governance discussions. International rule of law.
国际法治，
An important concept is
国际法治，
international rule of law. This phrase is particularly interesting because it demonstrates that China increasingly frames its arguments in legal terms. The white paper repeatedly invokes international law, international institutions, the United Nations Charter, and legal principles governing international relations. This is significant. It indicates that China generally presents itself as advocating reform through institutions rather than outside them. Yet, international law itself is never politically neutral. Law is always interpreted. International lawyers frequently disagree. Competing interpretations emerge. Precedents evolve. New technologies create entirely new legal questions. Consequently, debates over international law are likely to become increasingly important, particularly in areas such as artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, space activities, biotechnology, autonomous systems, and digital governance, consultation, joint construction, and shared benefits.
共商共建共享
One of the most distinctive expressions in contemporary Chinese diplomacy is
共商共建共享
consultation, joint construction, and shared benefits. The phrase contains 3 stages. First,
共商
consult together. Second,
共建
build together. Third,
共享
share the benefits. The formula is notable because it combines procedural and distributive ideas. Fair spread or allocation of resources, rights, or opportunities within a society. Governance is not simply about decision making. It is also about participation and outcomes. This principle appears repeatedly throughout China's development diplomacy. Its practical implementation naturally remains subject to debate. Nevertheless, as a normative principle, a standard, rule, or fundamental value used to judge how things ought to be rather than describing how they actually are. It is remarkably ambitious. The global south.
全球南方
Another major concept is
全球南方
global south. This term has become increasingly prominent in international politics. It refers not merely to geography. Australia, after all, lies geographically south of much of the world. Rather, it refers to historical experience. Many countries of the global south share experience of colonialism, late industrialization, development challenges, and comparatively limited influence within post-war international institutions. China increasingly presents itself as a developing country, a member of the global south, and a partner in development cooperation. This aspect of the white paper may prove particularly important if China increasingly positions itself as a leading advocate for global south interests. Then international politics may gradually become more plural and multipolar, where power, influence, and decision-making are dispersed rather than controlled by a single ruler or authority. That does not necessarily imply confrontation, but it may imply increasing institutional complexity. The philosophical foundations.
天下
Many scholars detect deeper intellectual influences behind these concepts. One such idea is
天下
all under heaven. Historically, Tianxia referred to an imagined political and moral order encompassing the known world. Modern scholars interpret the concept differently. Some regard it as a historical curiosity. Others see it as an alternative way of imagining international order. One influential interpretation argues that Tianxia emphasizes relationships and responsibilities rather than merely boundaries and competition. Whether contemporary Chinese diplomacy consciously reflects this tradition remains debated. But historically, it is bound up with the concept of the mandate of heaven, where a regime could legitimately rule until such time as it lost the mandate of heaven, which historically saw the Emperor of China as the Son of Heaven. These historical echoes should be validated and not too easily dismissed or ignored. Great harmony.
大同
Another classical concept is
大同
great harmony. This idea finds its origin in ancient Confucian thought. It imagines a world characterized by cooperation and moral order. Again, one should not be too readily drawn to simplistic conclusions. Modern Chinese foreign policy is obviously not based on ancient Confucianism. However, cultural roots should not be ignored either. States continue to pursue interests. Power politics remains real. Nevertheless, historical traditions often shape political vocabulary. Ideas possess remarkable longevity. Political languages accumulate historical layers. The white paper occasionally appears to draw upon precisely these traditions. Harmony without uniformity.
和而不同
Perhaps the most relevant classical principle is
和而不同
harmony without uniformity. This phrase comes from Confucius. Difference does not necessarily preclude cooperation. Uniformity is not vital for harmony. This idea may prove highly significant. The 21st century is increasingly characterized by multiple civilizations, multiple political systems, multiple development models, multiple technological systems. Perhaps the central question confronting humanity is whether these differences can coexist peacefully. The white paper appears to answer that question affirmatively. What could this mean for Australia? At first glance, these concepts may appear abstract and vague. They are not. Their implications for Australia may eventually prove substantial. Australia has traditionally operated within a relatively stable, liberal international framework. But should the world become genuinely multipolar, where multiple governance models increasingly coexist, where China, India, ASEAN countries, African states, and Middle Eastern powers gain greater influence over international institutions, Australia may increasingly need capabilities that go beyond traditional Western alliance strategies and management. Australian governance may require greater diplomatic agility, deeper Asia literacy, more highly developed language capabilities and cultural insights, enhanced understanding of international institutions, greater expertise in technology governance, and improved strategic planning capacity. Education programs are likely to need stronger, more intensive global studies focus. Public administration may require greater understanding of comparative governance systems. Business may require deeper knowledge of multiple regulatory environments. Artificial intelligence regulation may increasingly involve engagement with competing international standards. In other words, the challenge for Australia may not be choosing between competing worlds. Rather, it may be learning to operate competently within several diverse worlds simultaneously. And if that indeed is the future, then this Chinese white paper may ultimately be remembered not merely as a statement of diplomatic preferences, but as one of the earliest comprehensive attempts to describe the emerging intellectual architecture of a genuinely dynamic, multipolar age. Part 3. Historical origins. From
天下
2.
人类命运共同体
Community of shared future for mankind. If we wish to understand China's contemporary vision of global governance, we must first appreciate a fundamental reality. Political ideas rarely emerge suddenly. They accumulate, they inherit, they adapt. They reinterpret the past in order to explain the present and imagine the future. The ideas contained within China's 2026 white paper on global governance did not appear in isolation. They are products of multiple intellectual streams. Some are ancient, some are modern, some are distinctly Chinese, others are profoundly international. Some originate in Confucian philosophy. Some derive from 20th century anti-imperial struggles. Some emerge from Marxist thought. Some reflect China's experiences of evolution, economic development, and integration into global institutions. The result is not a single philosophical tradition. It is an intellectual synthesis. And perhaps one reason this document deserves careful attention is precisely because it attempts to bring together these diverse traditions into a coherent theory of international governance order. To understand the white paper, therefore, is to undertake something of an archaeological expedition through more than 2,000 years of political thought. The ancient world,
天下
all under heaven. One of the oldest concepts frequently associated with Chinese thinking about order is
天下
all under heaven. The phrase appears throughout classical Chinese texts. Its origins lie in the early Zhou period, more than 3,000 years ago. At its most literal level, Qianxia referred to the entire known world, but politically and philosophically, it carried a much richer meaning. In classical thought, Qianxia implied that order should encompass all peoples and territories. It was universal rather than tribal. It emphasized relationships rather than merely borders. Political authority was understood not solely in terms of coercive power, but also in moral terms. Legitimacy depended upon virtue. The ruler governed under
天命
the mandate of heaven. And importantly, the mandate of heaven was conditional. It could be lost. Poor governance undermined legitimacy. This idea was remarkable. Many ancient political systems justified power through divine inheritance or permanent hierarchy. Chinese political philosophy often insisted that authority carried moral obligations. Good government produced harmony. Bad government generated disorder. This principle would echo through Chinese history for millennia. Was Qianxia a world government? Modern scholars disagree profoundly about how Qianxia should be interpreted. Some view it as a hierarchical imperial system centered upon Chinese civilization. Others regard it as an early attempt to imagine universal political order. Some contemporary philosophers, such as Zhao Tingyang, have argued that Qianxia represents an alternative conception of international order. Rather than sovereign states existing in perpetual competition, Qianxia imagines political relationships organized around inclusion and mutual responsibility. Not everyone agrees with this interpretation. Critics argue that ancient Qianxia cannot simply be transplanted into modern international relations. Nevertheless, echoes of Qianxia can occasionally be heard in contemporary Chinese discourse. Consider expressions such as
人类命运共同体
a community with a shared future for mankind. The language is strikingly universal. It concerns humanity as a whole. Similarly, discussions of global governance, common security, shared development, and collective responsibility all possess intellectual affinities with broader Tianxia thinking. This does not mean that modern Chinese diplomacy is a direct continuation of imperial political philosophy. History is always more complicated than that, yet political traditions often survive through language, symbols, and conceptual habits. Ideas possess remarkably long memories. Great harmony,
大同
closely associated with Tianxia, is another ancient idea.
大同
Great harmony. The concept appears in the Confucian classic,
礼记
the Book of Rites. Perhaps one of the most famous passages states,
大道之行也，天下为公。
when the great way prevails, all under heaven is held in common. When the great way prevails, the world is for all. This passage has fascinated generations of Chinese intellectuals. The ideal society described is characterized by social cooperation, public responsibility, moral leadership, care for vulnerable populations, and a degree of collective well-being. Importantly, great harmony is aspirational. It is an ideal rather than a description of political reality. Throughout Chinese history, periods of instability often encourage thinkers to invoke Datong as a vision of better order. Consequently, great harmony repeatedly reappears in Chinese political discourse. Late Qing reformers invoked it. Republican thinkers employed it. Modern Chinese political language occasionally echoes it. Its continuing appeal lies in its capacity to imagine order beyond conflict and fragmentation. Harmony without uniformity.
和而不同
Perhaps the classical concept most directly relevant to contemporary global governance discussions is
和而不同
harmony without uniformity. The phrase appears in
论语
the Analects. Confucius observes,
君子和而不同，小人同而不和。
the noble person seeks harmony, but not sameness. The petty person seeks sameness, but not harmony. The philosophical implications are profound. Difference need not produce conflict. Agreement need not require continuity. Diversity can coexist with cooperation. This idea has obvious relevance for contemporary international relations. Today's world contains multiple civilizations, multiple religions, multiple political systems, multiple economic models, multiple developmental experiences. Can such diversity coexist peacefully? The white paper appears to answer yes. The phrase, harmony without uniformity, therefore provides an intellectual bridge between classical philosophy and contemporary discussions of multipolarity. The century of humiliation.
百年国耻
Yet ancient philosophy alone cannot explain modern Chinese thinking. Another historical experience proved equally formative. That is
百年国耻
the century of national humiliation. Beginning with the First Opium War and extending into the mid-20th century, China experienced military defeats, foreign occupations, unequal treaties, territorial losses, internal upheaval, and political fragmentation. This period profoundly shaped modern Chinese political consciousness. The experience generated several enduring lessons. National weakness invites external interference. Political fragmentation produces vulnerability. Economic underdevelopment limits sovereignty. International status matters, and perhaps most importantly, the structure of international order itself influences national security. These historical experiences help explain why sovereignty occupies such a central place in contemporary Chinese discourse. Anti-Imperialism and Self-Determination. 20th century Chinese political thought emerged within a world dominated by empires. Consequently, anti-imperialism became one of its defining characteristics. Modern Chinese leaders repeatedly emphasized national independence, territorial integrity, political self-determination, equality among states. These principles later became embedded in Chinese approaches to international relations. They also resonated strongly throughout Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Many newly independent states shared similar historical experiences. This common historical memory would eventually produce one of the most important events in post-war international politics, the Bandung Conference.
万隆会议
In 1955, representatives from 29 Asian and African countries gathered at the Bandung Conference in Indonesia. The conference represented an extraordinary moment. Many participants had only recently achieved independence. Some remained economically poor. Many possessed limited military power, yet collectively they represented a substantial portion of humanity. Bandung advanced several principles: respect for sovereignty, non-interference, equality among nations, peaceful coexistence, economic cooperation, anti-colonial solidarity. The conference marked the emergence of what would eventually become known as
全球南方
the Global South. Many of the themes emphasized in China's contemporary white paper bear striking similarities to Bandung principles. This continuity is significant. China increasingly presents itself not merely as a great power, but also as a participant in broader global South aspirations regarding international reform. The 5 principles of peaceful coexistence.
和平共处5项原则
Another foundational influence is
和平共处5项原则
the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. These are mutual respect for sovereignty, mutual non-aggression, non-interference in internal affairs, equality and mutual benefit, peaceful coexistence. These principles remain enormously influential within Chinese diplomacy. They help explain the emphasis that contemporary Chinese discourse places upon sovereignty, consultation, mutual benefit, non-interference, multilateral cooperation. One may debate how these principles should be interpreted or applied. Yet, there can be little doubt that they remain central organizing concepts within China's international thinking. Since issues such as Tibet, Xinjiang, and the South China Sea are deemed internal issues for China, they sit well within this non-interference framework. Of course, this is a framing philosophy that polities around the world do, and are likely to emulate. Reform and opening.
改革开放
The next major intellectual transformation occurred under Deng Xiaoping. Beginning in 1978, China embarked upon
改革开放
reform and opening. This period fundamentally transformed China's relationship with the international system. China increasingly integrated into international trade, global investment, international organizations, global production networks. This experience reinforced another lesson. Globalization could produce extraordinary economic benefits. Consequently, China developed strong interests in stability, predictable institutions, economic cooperation, international connectivity. Modern Chinese discussions of global governance therefore emerged partly from lived experience. China's development was deeply intertwined with global integration. This helps explain why the white paper simultaneously advocates reform while emphasizing stability. A community with a shared future for mankind.
人类命运共同体
The concept most closely associated with contemporary Chinese diplomacy is
人类命运共同体
a community with a shared future for mankind. The idea synthesizes many earlier traditions. From Tianxia comes universal concern. From great harmony comes cooperation. From harmony without uniformity comes pluralism. From Bandung comes sovereign equality. From the five principles comes peaceful coexistence. From reform and opening comes recognition of global interdependence. The concept therefore represents not a single idea, but an intellectual synthesis. It begins with an observation. Humanity faces increasingly interconnected challenges: climate change, pandemics, artificial intelligence, financial crises, cyber security, environmental degradation. No state can solve these problems alone. Interdependence creates shared vulnerabilities. Shared vulnerabilities require cooperative governance. This is the central logic underlying the concept. Why this matters to Australia. Australia often describes itself as a middle power, trading nation, Indo-Pacific democracy, the supporter of multilateralism. All of these identities depend upon functioning international institutions. Yet, the international environment is rapidly changing. Asia is becoming increasingly influential and assertive. The global south is becoming increasingly important. Technology is transforming the tools and concepts of governance. Artificial intelligence may reshape economies and societies. In such an environment, Australia may increasingly need capabilities that were previously less essential. Long-term strategic planning, comparative governance expertise, deep regional literacy, Asian language capabilities, institutional flexibility, sophisticated technology diplomacy, an ability to engage simultaneously with multiple normative traditions. Perhaps the central challenge facing Australia is not whether China's vision will replace existing institutions. Rather, it may be whether Australia can adapt successfully to a world in which multiple conceptions of legitimate order coexist and compete. If that world emerges, then this white paper may ultimately prove historically significant, not because it determines the future. No document can do that, but because it attempts to provide an intellectual map for navigating one possible future, a future that is increasingly multipolar, increasingly interconnected, increasingly technological, and increasingly characterized by the coexistence of multiple visions of world order. And for Australia, understanding these visions may become one of the prerequisites for navigating the 21st century successfully, actively addressing inflexible ideological mindsets that serve to frustrate and undermine constructive change, holding tightly to ingrained thoughts that gravely endanger the relatively embryonic enterprise that is Australia.